Hello all. Still getting used to the camera rig here, so forgive me if things are not perfectly in focus. Also trying to figure out if this background is too light, too dark, etc. This is the Remington R51. It is the successor to the Remington 51, if I'm not mistaken, which was a 380. And this is a 9mm single stack. And I think it is. Yes, there we go. There's the magazine. I wasn't sure if this was the right magazine or not. It's a novel gun in a lot of ways. Notably, the grip safety is huge and different. This is not like the 1911 grip safety. This is a fairly big deal safety. The trigger is blocked. All sorts of other things are blocked at the same time. When you hold the gun, you're naturally going to put that grip in, and then everything works. But the way this works is nightmarish, and we'll get into that. But there's some other things that are interesting about it. It does have an ambidextrous magazine release, and in this case you can see that there's mag catches on both sides, so it's not using a center drop, it's just built-in ambidextrousness. And well, I think it's easiest to just get into it. So this gun has been noted as being really hard to take down, and it is, and we'll try and make that as easy as possible. So first things first, though, is there is a takedown notch. It is very small, so this is your slide lock. So if I was going to lock it open. Oh, the other thing is, in all operations of this gun, make sure the grip safety is in there. If you try and, you can rack it without that, but just about everything else we're going to do assumes that the grip safety is held in. So if I forget to say that in process and you're having any issue, that's probably what it is. So anyway, slide lock notch, and then this little tiny half moon shape is the takedown notch. And basically right above where that pin goes through the gun is the other side of that. And so only right there can you lift that out. Of course. I was wondering if there was anywhere else you could do that as I said that, which is, in case you're wondering, like, is it blocked there? And the answer is yes. The slide itself blocks there. So, okay, so that's not rocket science. We've done that before. But now, what do you do? And the answer is, well, grip it, pull the slide back some, and the reason these serrations are there is so you can grab it. This will hurt your fingers somewhat, but you grab it by the barrel. He said, and then failed. Pull it all the way back, grab it by the barrel, and pull the thing off. And things will come apart. We're going to get into this later. It is a chore in itself. Notably, my breech block fell out, so if yours didn't, then yours looks more like this at this point. If it's in just the right position, the barrel does exert some pressure on that, so if your breech block isn't coming out, push the barrel forward a little bit and tip it out. Now, I do like the breech block as a concept simply because you don't have to drive pins through the frame and all that. You just get it all in one little bundle. But now you're left with well, how the hell do you get the barrel out? And it has this huge bushing and a fairly substantial spring and a whole lot of unanswered questions. And the secret sauce is that you're going to push the barrel back until, what a pain in the butt. So you're going to push it. If it's not perfectly centered, it doesn't come all the way back. So if you're having issues, that's probably part of it. Notice that the barrel does come partially out here, but if you try and lift up, you're going to get nowhere other than potentially slightly mangling your gun. The bushing here, there is a cutout in the slide where it's just from here to here that's long enough to get the bushing out. So the idea is you're going to compress the barrel to there, and then when it's in, it's never easy. When it's in that spot, in theory, and everything is perfectly vertical, it'll just magically come out really easily. Can't you see how easy it is? Oh, the ease. Thank you, Remington. I feel like I'm doing this wrong now. That's embarrassing. Like maybe I'm supposed to manhandle that piece. Oh, there it is. Wow, that sucks. I was thinking that you just push the whole thing, tip it out, and you're good to go, but they didn't actually machine enough space around that to make your barrel lock up a little tighter, which means you're going to bring the barrel back and then grab the bushing itself and draw the bushing back till the bushing's in that same space. That's the right space. But the barrel has to be fairly well retracted so that you're not tipping it while it's still inside the slide. And then guide out the bushing and colossal spring. So to illustrate that without quite as much of the grunting, we'll put it back together, following the same fundamental premise, which is curse at Remington, and you know. So the issue we were having is that this barrel, there's no tipping going on there. You know, there's very little room for that barrel to tip. If the barrel is further back, and everything's lined up, there's a little tip, but you know, not a lot. And so what you've got to do is get it back inside the slide, where then you have plenty of room to manipulate it, and at the same time keep the bushing into the area here, so the bushing can come in and out here, but it can't go in and out back there. And the barrel can kind of come in and out just about anywhere, but only if the bushing is willing to move at the same time. And if the barrel's in there, engaged at the front of the slide, it's never going to tip enough for you to get it all the way out of the gun. So the combination of those two things means you've got to deal with the bushing, the barrel, and all of that at the same time to get it to actually behave. Easier said than done. There we go. All right, so once again, pull the barrel back a bit, pull the bushing forward a bit, tip it out, get the barrel out, hang on to that bushing because it has a huge spring behind it, and lift it up and guide it out only when the bushing is aligned with that cutout. Barrel itself, take a minute just to talk about it. It's not that interesting. Center feed does have grooves, so it is held in place there pretty firmly. This is not a tipping barrel design. This is a blowback operated gun. When the barrel is in place, the gun ain't moving. The barrel ain't moving. The gun goes bang, barrel goes nowhere, force goes into your hand, and the casing operates the gun. These tend to have a little more felt recoil than tipping barrel designs, but not a whole lot. You just don't see pure blowback in much over 9mm. Usually 380 is where they draw the line. If you see this crap on here, it's because rubber bands were on it for a long time and rotted off. And again, that groove is just where the locking pin sits to hold everything together. All right, so mechanically, our little breech block doesn't do a whole lot there either. It can move back and forth, but that's mainly for assembly reasons, it does not actually move around. Or does it? I gotta think about it. No, it does not actually move around once the gun is assembled and in operation. You know, as soon as I say that, it sounds like it's not true. So now I gotta think about that. Sorry, guys. Let's take a peek. So when we're assembling it, we will get past that, and the extractor will sit there. So it can tip down, but it wouldn't. If it tips down, then it's just going to engage with the. It's going to stop anything from working. So I think it's more likely that it sits. So if it goes bang. Oh no, it does tip down. Well, that's interesting. So it tips down, you fire it, and the slide starts to go backwards. The grooves that hold the locking block in sit like this under it, which means as the slide begins to go backwards, this block really can't. And so the slide will come back and lift this to the point where it can then slide over the rest of it. But if that's true, then so how's that going to work? If it sits in the back and you fire it, it has to be forward to fire. If it ain't forward, you're not gonna reach the chamber. Or are you? I think we're gonna have to take a look at this. Now I'm not sure if this thing is moving around or not. So if we, where's my flashlight? If we look down the little hole, the breech block is actually being held to the back. And it does have a little bit of room to move, and then it gets interrupted by the slide. And so the breech block actually does the dropping instead of the slide. So as we're coming forward, that breech block is going to be there. Okay, all right, so, wow. Didn't think that was how it worked because I had taken it apart in 2 different days. So anyway, grabbing the barrel, get it apart. Oops. After we take down the takedown pin. This is how we learn, by the way. Look at it, we think about it, realize that we're not sure what the hell's going on, and we figure it out. So when the gun's in battery, that's actually pushed forward. So when it fires, the force of the cartridge will be able to push the breech block back. But because of the shape of everything, when it does so, it's going to push the breech block down into the body where that's what all this wear is from. The breech block will get caught on the frame. So in that first 1/8 of an inch of motion, as the breech block is moving backwards, it's also moving the slide with it. And then it gets stopped by the frame, leaving all the momentum in the slide to finish charging the gun. And when it comes back forward, let's see, what part of the frame is going to push that? What's happening when it comes forward? That's caught there. Oh, sure. It runs into the barrel, which, let's see. No, it's coming forward. And then, what's going to push that forward? Is it these grooves? When it hits them, it will be pushed up. What else holds that in a forward position? That is curiouser and curiouser. Alice. Let's look at this locked up. Barrel can't go nowhere. Breech block is fully closed, and something is holding it up at that point in history. When it goes bang, or is it? Maybe it's not. Maybe it sits like that. No, that wouldn't make any sense. Something's got to hold that up, or it would rattle. Oh, is it just the rounds? The whole thing? Oh, that's the money shot. Nope, he's wrong. So if there's a round in there, it would hold it up a little bit. Something to simulate a round. So if there's a round in the magazine, that would serve to provide upward force. But when the last round is spent, so it goes bang and it starts to go backwards and it's caught. So it can only go backwards that far, and that means it shoots the slide ahead. Slide comes back. Oh, that's what it is. Okay. So yes, there's not a whole lot of room for this guy to move, and the slide is being pushed forward . Let me get this right. So when it's in battery, we can see through that hole, which is a loaded chamber indicator. And then when it begins to cycle, oh, so it's down. It does naturally sit in the down position. And then when it fires, that's going to push the block and slide back until this block is caught by the frame, at which point it will lift itself upwards. Wow. So gun goes bang, frame, the whole thing starts moving back, frame intercepts here, pushes it up, but then it continues to cycle. I'm astounded that does not completely wear through this aluminum frame much faster. I mean, obviously it hits hard, but then it's lifted up, and then it slides back. And then it comes back forward, and when it rams into the barrel again, it tips back down and locks itself up. Okay. All right, so sorry for that confusion. That's a little bit of an unusual mechanism. Instead of a barrel that tips out of the way so the slide can go over it, you have this block which initially is in that locked position. It fires and moves backwards a little bit till the frame intercepts it, at which point it gets pulled up and into the slide and then continues back with the slide. And when it comes back into battery, the collision with the barrel pushes it back into the locked position for the next round. So bang, they move back a little bit, they get intercepted, and then all the momentum is now transferred. It picks up the block again and continues. Okay. I gotta think about that some more before I can come up with something intelligent to say about why they did that, as opposed to having this just fixed in place so that as the round goes off, it just accelerates the whole thing backwards. Why they needed it to disconnect, move back, and then reconnect. And why does this need to really do this on every round? No clue. No damn clue at all. Somebody has a really great idea about why that mechanism is there. For the love of God, share in the comments. All right, let's disassemble the rest of it. Doesn't look crazy complex, except for my poor little bent punch here. I didn't want anyone to see. It's so sad. If I straighten it out, it'll crack. So this pin is holding in the firing pin, and it's got a large end and a small end, and so I'm hoping that we just drive out from this side and well, maybe that damn thing is pressed in there like a... It's gonna be one of those videos, isn't it? I'm looking for a more substantial punch. This one's too big. I'm going to hold off on that for a minute and take out the extractor. There we go. Now the extractor... I'll get my shit together eventually, guys. Bear with me. Just a rubber plug, not a metal spring. So crushable, squishy rubber is the whole thing holding pressure on. It's a fairly decent sized extractor. Not a whole lot of angling. It's back faced so it can snap over around, and it is edged off at just an angle, and I suspect that has something to do with the fact that it has to tip. Just the tip. I'm not going to drive that one the rest of the way out. I'm just going to go back and give this guy one more old college try. All I'm doing is succeeding in bending my punch even more. So now I'm looking around the room wishing I had more punches. I'm going to try and straighten this punch out, at which point it will probably snap. That is one sad ass punch. Hopefully yours comes apart a little bit easier than this, because mine don't. I mean, obviously it was pressed in. That's why this end is squishy and flat. I don't think that was a washer of any type. Well, I apologize. I don't think it's rocket science to figure out what's going on with that spring and firing pin. Obviously, it's a firing pin with a hole in it, so it's retained by the pin, and then there's a firing pin return spring that's fairly hefty, and then the firing pin itself. So apologies, I'm going to have to not take this out right now because I just don't have a hard enough surface or a working small punch at the moment to get that out. But should you take it out, I think you would find that it's less than extremely interesting. Getting the extractor lined back up is proving to be mildly a pain in the ass. There we go. So, some tips. If you find you're bending a punch, there's a couple reasons for that. The main one is that no matter how solid you think your work surface is, it really is just a big spring, unless it is, a built industrial bench. And even then, if it's wood, not metal, it's still going to have some spring to it. And so I'm on a regular table. I've got two 1-inch melamine boards on it, and then some cloth padding and this sheet of leather and this rubber hockey puck. Now you add all that up, the legs are 2-3 feet away from the center where I am to the corners. That means I've got a wooden diving board platform, a bunch of padding, and another big rubber platform. All of that is absorbing all of my hammer force, and that sets up a return bounce basically back through the punch, which tends to cause a vibration in it, leading to that energy that would normally just go up and down, turning into energy going out to one side, and punches will bend. So if you're bending punches, your work surface is too soft. I know this is too soft. When I really need to get something out, I either put it in the press or I take it next door to where there's just concrete floor. Now, the rubber block on the concrete floor, rubber block is, this is not the bounciest rubber in the world. So that gives me far less rebound transfer. So if I take something just into the next room where there's concrete to hammer against, with just a minimal amount of padding, my punches don't bend like they do on TV, so to speak. So that's just a tip. If stuff is hard to get out, or a pin is just not moving, move to a harder surface and then hammer it out, and you'll have more luck. So I guess that's all we're going to be able to do for this on the top, which is no big deal. So let's just toss it back together. So again, squish that guy up until he gets mostly in there, and then we're going to come in on the side. And what you see me doing with a punch here is the spring tends to not quite line up, so I push the spring back into the center so that the barrel can then come through it, at which point now my barrel and bushing are essentially lined up. This guy, you will have to bring the barrel forward a little bit for him to pop into place. And before you go to put it on the gun, do your best to center that, or that will cause you some heartache, and we'll get into that on reassembly. So I'm going to set him aside for now. The reason you're really here is all about this thing. Now, if you notice, I've left this pin a little bit pushed out right now. That's because these are steel pins, and this is an aluminum frame gun. And unlike a 1911 or something with a steel frame and steel pins, Or, more importantly, something to hold the pins in on one side, so you can put a head on the pin and then something else covers it. With aluminum, what you tend to do is you make these serrated pins. So if you get a good look at this guy, hopefully you can see that there's like gear teeth all around the outside, little serrations. It's only on the right side of the pins, and it's only on the sear pin and the hammer pin. But I take it back, it's on these front pins too. What that means is that they're a giant pain in the butt to get out, and every time you put them back in the gun, you're doing a little more damage to the aluminum because the steel pushes the aluminum out of the way. So there's a finite number of times you'll be able to actually take these apart before you've wallered these holes out beyond repair. So that's why I didn't slam that one all the way back in when I had it apart the other night. The other thing is these lovely plastic grip panels are not just decorative. The reason they're there is because there are 2 free floating pins on the inside, 3 if you count the hammer strut pin, and nothing holds them in, and they slide left and right very easily, so there's these 2 plates on either side to hold them in, which is a little bit goofy in my opinion, but there it is. So I'm going to go ahead and discharge the hammer to take a little of that stress off. And I'm going to take these plates off. Mine happens to have Torx screws. Yours may just have Allen screws. Don't know, but either way, use the right tool. These are relatively nice screws in that they include a rubber gasket. I love people who put little gaskets so that you don't have to over-tighten grip screws and worry about stripping threads out, and you also don't have to worry about them backing out. The rubber gasket is the holy grail of solutions to that problem. Now, don't just tip this over and knock the panel off, because like I said, here's the stuff. These pins will fall out with no warning. They're barely in there. There's just a tiny bit of spring pressure on them. This is a little more substantial, but again, that's why the panels are here, is because these are easily moved. So I'm going to leave my panel in place while I do this so that I don't just drop pins and have parts come spewing out in all directions. So pop off that guy and this guy. And now I'm going to put a thumb over those, and likewise on this side, while I take out the larger one. And not sure how much tension that's under. I think that there's still some amount of tension there. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put the block there to hold those pins in. See how that pin already dropped down a little bit? That's what's going on. And rather than just hammer this out, which is probably just fine to do, I'm going to push in on the on the bottom here is the hammer spring retaining cup. And so I'm going to push that in a bit so that that can just drop out gently. And stuff falls out. So this is that pin. So in theory, yes, a good solid whack would have gotten that past this piece where it locks into place. Whoops, jeez. For my next trick. So it locks into place because it goes through this, but it also goes through this gap. And because of the little barbell shape, it's gonna, the top part where the spring pressure is coming down from the top, so that will tend to seat and hold this. If you hit it, it will move to the middle because of the shape, but you know, relieving the pressure is just easier. And then you have the tail, which is just the cup to hold it all in there. Then you have the spring and the cup for the hammer. So the hammer tail sits in there to keep it aligned, and then that stays aligned inside the actual spring itself. And as you can tell, there's not a whole lot of distance left. If you look, there's only about 5 coils of that spring. So when this hammer cocks, it don't go real far. And then the whole thing, the spring can only come so far up because it's retained inside the big old grip safety. And then this piece on the bottom just holding the whole thing together. So this does more than it would seem, and we'll get into that because it's obviously part of that safety mechanism. But what I'm going to do now is simply flip it up and stick my plate back on so I don't lose my other pins while I'm sitting here yakking about it. This one's already gotten out of alignment a tad, so I'm going to put these back on just to hold things where they are. And now we're going to look before we take this apart, because there's stuff that is almost unfathomable in terms of initial view and the complexity of what's going on here. So this spring was the biggest challenge for me. Once I had it out of the gun, I could not figure out for the life of me how it went in there or what it does. So when the grip safety goes on, there's potentially a tiniest of wear marks. Whoops, sorry if I'm off camera. Right about there. It's hard to point. That guy there. That's the spring. That's right where he sits. So he kind of rides up and down there. But the point is that that's what's holding pressure on. So when the grip safety is in there, this spring is suddenly under tension. Well, what does that spring do? The answer is it lifts up what I'm just going to call the carriage. You can call it the disconnector, the connector. Essentially, this piece here and its counterpart on the other side are a single piece. It's a U-shaped piece of metal, and if I push it down, the little spring that I'm holding pressure on is what's pushing it back up. If I let go of that spring and push it down, it'll come back up. So that's what the spring is doing, and it does that. This piece here, if you can see it, this guy right here, and that little spring right there under the side of it. So this piece here and the spring I'm talking about, I'm going to wiggle it around. There it is poking out, and there it is under pressure, lifting that thing up. Doesn't seem like it's substantial enough to actually do its job, so that's what took me the longest time, because I failed to note where I got it from originally. It goes on the hammer, and you're like, it doesn't actually do anything that involves the hammer, so kind of a head trip. Anyway, this is the hammer strut with a nice rounded end to sit in the end of the cup. And then let's see if I can make that hammer go. I'm not going to be able to because of the safety. All right, so hammer strut out of the way, and let's talk about what else we can see. This thing here is the grip safety. When you push in on the grip safety, it rides along the left and right side of this piece here and pulls it down. And if you notice, the right side is a little taller and the left side is a little shorter, and this block on the left with the silver spring is the hammer stop. So should the sear fail, this piece engages the hammer and stops it from going all the way forward. On the right with the bronzy gold spring, red, whatever, is the actual real sear that hangs onto the hammer. So this, while it can only move up and down, it's moved up and down by you pushing the grip safety in and out. So you push it in, and the resulting force basically pulls this evenly on both sides down. Now when it's up, it's blocking both of those. When it's down, they're clear to move. So that's what's going on in the grip safety. Now before I do anything else, what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock out one of these pins. And then I'm going to knock the top one out because it lets us do something very handy with the grip safety, which is flip it out of the way so that we can see everything else. I'm going to go ahead and remove it all the way since we're here, but I'm going to caution you, notice that this is a coil spring and it's held in place only by this second pin. So when I go to take this pin out, the minute I pass the coil spring, that's going to want to launch. So I'm going to stick a finger in there to try and minimize the resulting launch vector. So these two pins are the same, and then this is that safety. So the big hole in there for the spring to sit, and basically the pins come in from the side and hold that down. But because these are, wide ovals, it can actually move up. And so the spring is going to push it up into position. The force of the grip safety, drop those parts out of it. The grip safety, where does the grip safety actually engage this guy? These legs right here are going to come down when you push it in, and they are going to push the whole thing down. So this up and down just like that. So when you push in the grip safety, that's what you're doing. You're just pulling this double sear block out of the way so it's no longer blocking either the sear side or the safety side. All right, now that those two little pins are taken care of, we don't have to worry about the grip panels holding anything together, because that's what they hold in place, is the grip safety. And we can get a little bit better eyeball of what's going on with the rest of the gun. Now, for everything to operate, I do have to put tension on that spring, so I'll try and demonstrate as much as I can, and then pull that down and operate it. So what you'll see is there's a trigger bar, which is this guy down here. And these little L-shaped legs on either side that come out, they're actually going into a groove on the trigger bar. So that's why that acts as a disconnector. So when this spring is down, the disconnector is being held high. I can come and operate it with my finger though, and you'll see the net result is the trigger bar moving up and down as those little L-shaped legs move up and down. So I put pressure on the L-shaped leg puts pressure on the trigger bar moves down, and of course, if I'm not putting pressure there, it can come down on its own. So as long as I put pressure there, that holds the trigger bar up. Trigger bar has to be held up in order for the trigger to actually engage. So I'm going to hold that down with a punch to try and make a little more light. I'm going to flip that out of the way one more freaking time, or maybe two, and try and demonstrate this one more time. So now, as I pull the trigger bar, the first thing I engage is the left side, which is the hammer block. So first we're going to have a huge amount of take up that's just moving the hammer block out of the way, and then we finally engage the sear. And once we engage the hammer block and the sear, then the hammer can actually go forward. So that's the bang part. Now, as the gun cycles, the slide will run over this and cause a disconnect. And the disconnect part means it gets dropped down. So we pulled the trigger, both the sear and the hammer block are forward. When the disconnect gets operated, it's going to drop down and release first the sear and, well, if I hadn't bent the damn thing, it would have released everything. There we go. And so the hammer block and sear block both get, or is it just the one? You know what? I said that. Yeah, I'm a big fat liar. It doesn't actually release the hammer block. It just releases the sear, so the sear can re-engage. The hammer block doesn't appear to be able to re-engage until you let up on the trigger. That's kind of interesting. So the disconnect only disconnects from the sear. So what, right? Another weird thing is the ejector and why it's allowed to flop around. And the answer is it's only allowed to do that during disassembly. When it's assembled, that pretty much doesn't get to do much moving. All right, now we're going to knock out these pins. Like I said, this is another one where you might need to go to a harder surface to get these guys moving. Since mine are a little worn, they should come out. First, I'm going to just take out the hammer pin. So even though this guy was already, halfway out when I started, there's a nice up close and personal view of the serrations around the end of the pin, and with enough light you can probably see the corresponding marks it's left in the gun itself, around that edge. Maybe, I don't know, can't tell if it's focusing. So now, with that out, the hammer strut and hammer and that one goofy spring should all be able to come out. And the question is if I can disentangle that spring sufficiently to make that happen. Come on. There's my hammer caught on. Is it caught on the sear? That would be a logical thing for a hammer to be caught on. Yeah, I think it was. Oh, jeez, I got the hammer strut on the damn inside. There we go. So a little wiggling and it will come out, and then its spring will fall out as well. The spring tends to get hung up on the other piece. Once this is all apart, it will make a lot more sense. And frankly, you can just kind of knock all the pins out and shake stuff, but then you'll take a while to figure out where it all went. So just remember the hammer, and that was the little bushing that spring rides on, and its pin. And now we're going to drive out the other pin, and that's going to release a whole bunch of stuff at once. It will free up the ejector, the disconnector, both springs, the hammer block, and the sear all at the same time. So once you hit this point, yeah, this is definitely the point of no return. So once again, serrated edge pin, and there's no two ways about it. These little springs are about to go flying all over the place. So we just kind of hold it all in place and hope for the best, and then shake out all the guts. So here we have both springs, the block, the sear, and the disconnector. Once you get it off of the trigger bar, will rotate and come out like that. And here's a better view now of the back of the trigger bar, so you can see that the trigger bar curves over. Those little claws on the right and left make a rail on the left and right that this guy actually rides in. So when he's in there, whoops, he rides in those rails. We'll get the trigger out and it'll be more obvious. Now, the disconnector was the only thing holding the ejector in. The ejector is a little strange. There's a little, it looks like a pin. It's part of the actual gun though, so don't try and take it out. That ejector is held in simply by the fact that once the disconnector is here and sitting back here, it can no longer move far enough left and right to get off of its little pin. What did throw me is it looks like at some point in time they were going to make a pin that went through all of that and then changed their mind and just did this little permanent guy. I don't know what the logic was. I mean, it looks like it was pushed in, from one side or the other, but it just doesn't come all the way through to fix this in place, which it looks like it should be in there on a pin, but it's really not. It's able to move around a lot, and I think that helps it kind of maintain its alignment with the trigger bar as the trigger bar is moving around. All right, so one other novelty about the trigger is you notice the trigger, there's no return force going on with the gun as it is, and the actual trigger return spring is this this spring here, and so these little legs are going to want to push the trigger forward so long as something is pushing this down. And the question is, well, what pushes that down? And the answer is the rest of the gun. It's when the barrel goes back in there, that the barrel itself is holding that spring down, and that's your trigger return force, is this barrel holding that down, which means that once the barrel's off, you got nothing to worry about in terms of springs flying all over the place. Now we're going to go into all these details in a minute. First, we're going to go ahead and see if we can't take the trigger out, and I think I might also have to take the stupid magazine release out first. I didn't take the trigger out last night. Oh, that's going to be depressing. I can tell already that this is the type of magazine release that, because of the position and the strength of that spring, I am never going to get it back in there once I get it out. So this is depressing. There's my bent ass punch. Let's see if it's even got enough strength left in it to move that. Oh, it's moving a little bit. Okay, so I'm taking out the magazine release pin. Oh yeah. Put my finger over it because there's a spring. I just don't know how we're going to get it back in. So taking a look at this, let's see if we can slide that back in a bit. Maybe it won't be too bad. This leg on the left is going to be the real challenge, whatever it's pushing against. It's going to be, oh, it sits on the piece of the frame itself, so maybe we'll be able to get it in there. Who knows? Now, interestingly, it does engage in both notches at once, and when you push on it from the left or right, what you're doing. Let's see if we can. Ooh, that's very goopy. Let's de-goop it so it's not so horrible to look at. Oh, that's so gross. Sort of grease from the factory. Alright, so let's go ahead and get rid of the spring and just take the actual release and think about how it sits in the universe. And if I were a betting man, I would say that the tail has these angled pieces, and the tail sits right here, so that if I push in from the left or the right, it's going to make it push the tail in with it. So in order for this to move left or right, that tail has to go up or out, essentially. And since it's on a pivoting point, when this tail is brought forward, the top part is brought backwards. So this is sitting there holding this. You push the magazine release in, which is actually lifting this side forward and this side back, and it slides right out. Whereas when you go to put it in, just the magazine itself pushes it in place until the spring pops it in there with two pretty good positive locks. So this is not a magazine that's going to wear out anytime soon, which is kind of a nice feature. And I'm just going to put this back together so I have some vague memory of how it went. And I feel like I've already gotten it wrong. Yep, I had it backwards. So that's a smart thing to do if you're a smart person. And if you're really smart, you don't need to remember things, but if you're not so smart like me, helps to put them back a little bit like how you got them out. All right, and then last but not least is our trigger pin. Once again, with the world's most pathetically bent punch. Try to bend it back a little bit. Oh, that's sad. Believe it or not, it is actually moving, just not real fast. Oh, it's also bending the punch. All right, I'm gonna have to suck it up and go find a better punch. But I don't want to stop. Trying to do this trick and choke up on the punch a bit. Try not to smash my camera. Hey, it worked. Hallelujah. Those clever guys at SIG, or H&K, made this punch. And I don't think I've ever really figured out all the ins and outs of using them, because they basically have a sleeve that they're in, and you can remove the sleeve completely, but I think the idea is that if you choke up on it, it's the same width as the punch for a good bit of it. I think that's actually potentially there to help you keep from deforming your punches like I have. Alright, so this should just be the trigger bar and the little spring, and looks like it comes out through the back. Which way is it going to have enough room to maneuver? Oh yeah. Ta-da! There she blows. And again, this is kind of neat. You know, this spring isn't going spraying all over the place, making our day suck and making it hard to put back in. Take a note, HK and Smith & Wesson M&P and everybody else who ever created a really hard to put back together trigger spring. So clean this guy off a little bit because I was lazy and didn't take it all the way apart last time. All right, now we can actually look at how this thing works. Here's my other pin. Is that the trigger pin? So we'll drop the pin on the floor. That's what we'll do. Son of a beehive. Oh, hey, look, there's the right size punch that I was looking for. Amazing what you find on the floor. Ugh. Sorry about that. Now I dropped my flashlight. Good Lord. Ow. Get out. Deep breaths. Alright, so put our trigger pin through its little hole just to hold our trigger roughly in place. I'm going to illustrate how these things go together. So this piece, these little rails, live there, and their whole job is to be able to move this up and down. So when the slide pushes on the top of this, whoops, on the slide cycles, it's going to push on the top here and move the trigger bar down, and the obnoxious spring that sits on the hammer, whoops, only if I hold it correctly, actually sits over here just under that. Is that all visible where you can see what I'm doing? And it is designed to lift this back up. So that's what this spring is doing in life, is trying to hold this up as much as possible unless the slide pushes it down. And so the rest of it, it's all about riding the rails. So the hammer, hammer sits in here like that. And the other aspect that I wanted to demonstrate with this little out of the gun build was that when you add the sear pin in as well, what you have is a tracking direction for this process. Whoops, and it fell all the way through. Well, tits. Okay, so it can go up and down only as much as those two pins let it, and it will also track in that direction. So that's kind of limits what can happen. So as flimsy as all this looks, what you're really doing is getting a very controlled amount of up and down motion on your trigger bar. Make sense? Okay. So I'll take that out of the gun, take this out of the gun, and now we're going to talk about how these guys interact. Let me try and use the whole thing together to demonstrate. First, we'll show how each of them interact with the hammer. So this is the hammer block. Down at the bottom, this is just the long leg so that the short leg of the grip safety can block it or not block it. It will be caught by the trigger, just like the sear will. And when it's not being pulled out of place, this is what it does. It sits there and engages the hammer. Now here's the sear notch way up here. So if the sear should let go for some reason, this thing is going to stop it long before the hammer can reach the money shot. So this is a safety of, it's like the half cock notch concept safety. So when you're actually going to fire it, this one has a lot further to go, so it moves out of the way first, and then only later do you deal with the sear side. I'm going to flip all this around to show the sear side. Sear is, again, not rocket science for a sear. It sits in there, and when the trigger bar pushes on the bottom of it, that rotates it out of engagement with the hammer, and the hammer is free to come forward and go bang. And then as soon as it does, the disconnect will happen, which frees up the spring of the sear to push down against the hammer again as the slide's going back, so the sear will catch. And then when you do finally lift up on it, when you lift up on the trigger, then you're also allowing this guy, the hammer stop, which is always in contact with the trigger. As your finger comes off, this goes back in. So basically, if your finger's not pulling the trigger halfway, this hammer block is in place. So no matter what else goes wrong, drop safety wise, every other imaginable abuse of the gun, you're pretty much not going to be able to defeat this as far as I can tell. Now when it comes to the springs for these guys, they're a little strange, but not super strange. They just sit around the coil around that raised rim, and they just sit here. This is above where the trigger is doing all of its engagement, and also well above where the safety goes, so it just kind of sits right there. And when you put it in the gun, this spring actually bottoms out right there. Let me again shine a light on me. So if we can see this, let's see. Crazy angles. Yes. So this mark here, that's where the spring sits. And on the other side, a mark where the gold spring sits. So try and illustrate that all on the same camera shot. Gold spring sits here, silver spring sits here. So they just push up against the frame to provide their tension. And so because this is pushed up against the frame, it wants to move the hammer block that way. Something has to push against the spring to bring that forward and out of engagement with the hammer. And this one is almost identical. It's just machined backwards directionally because it's on the right side instead of the left side. And so again, the little leg sits on the front of it, and the spring sits there, and that puts tension on the sear to push against the hammer until something comes along like the trigger bar, pushes it out of the way, at which point your spring wants to push it right back in. Trigger bar brings it up, spring brings it back down. So those guys all sit in alignment with the lower notch and do their thing. I think that's everything. I don't seem to see any other parts. So we didn't take this out because it's just a roll pin holding it together, and it's kind of fragile-ish looking, and whenever I have things that look vaguely fragile, I make it a point not to mess with them if I don't have to. So I will just come in here and wipe the schmutz off of it. None of these surfaces are particularly tumbled or polished as far as I can tell. I'm surprised that the gun isn't a lot more rough. I have read some people online that said my gun was rough, and eventually I took it apart and put it back together, and now it's magically great. So I suspect that a little bit more polish from the factory might have made this a more popular firearm. Alright, I'm going to muck about it too much. So, putting it back in, there is a limited range of area where this can go. The trigger bar is too wide to come out the top. So if you notice, this area here is carved in. That's for the trigger bar to fit, but it can only go up and down so far. While I have it apart, I'm going to actually do a quick wipe with the Q-tip in the grubbiest areas, just because I doubt I'll be taking this guy apart anytime soon again. And this way I can pretend that I mostly have a clean gun. Doesn't require too much fouling in general. So we slide this guy in. Whoops! No, we don't. We put the itty bitty spring back on first. And remember that the it has to have room to not engage. So the split part of the spring is at the bottom where it doesn't get in the way of the trigger itself, and the cross part is at the top where the barrel will hold it in place. And just a little finagling. Should be able to get this to go back in. Maybe, maybe not. Appears to only want to go in trigger forward. I keep bumping into something. All else fails, do it upside down. So keep the trigger forward and get us into place. Coolio. I feel like I'm a pin short. I have a trigger pin, and I have my it's in the magazine bit. Okay. Now remember, the serrations are all on the left side of the gun, so when you go to put things back together, line up all the holes, and the pins go in from the left to the right. Now, if you're super coordinated, you can wiggle that pin and feel where it starts to engage so that you're lined up with the previous set of serrations. If you're lazy, you can switch to the plastic mallet so you don't have to aim. If you're less lazy, what I like to do is use a punch with a significantly larger size so that I'm, over the whole area and just stop before I actually have that blow. So I can still feel that just the tiniest bit. If you're really coordinated, you can get that final tap in, but it's not going anywhere, and it certainly isn't going to interfere with how it feels. Oh, I guess technically I didn't take this spring out. Do you really need to figure that out? It shouldn't be that big a challenge. If you lift out this leg from the frame, then you'll be able to get the whole piece out. And all this is doing is the takedown pin has a piece that snaps under it, so that's what pulls the takedown lever back down. I don't see any burning need to actually remove that because it looks like it's tiny parts that are a pain in the butt. So now we will deal with the challenge of this. This is one of those things where maybe slave pins would help. We'll find out shortly as to exactly how many curse words you're going to learn today as I try and get this back into place. Obviously, you're not going to be able to see any of this because I'm sticking my fingers into a dark hole. Yeah, that's what she said. Oh, let's be rocket scientists and, well, let's do everything wrong. All right, so step 1, throw the spring on the floor. Step 2, realize that you forgot to put the actual magazine release in. Step 3, be embarrassed in public in front of everyone listening. All right, so let's think this guy through again. So the spring goes in on this side. This was pretty easy to remember because this leg of the spring was pointing up, and then it's the left side that's pointing down. So in terms of this part, kind of important not to forget that. I think this would be easy, but apparently it requires some amount of coordination. All right, so not even close. Wow. So, in order to spare you all the magic of editing has just happened, and I got it back in, and here's the dirty little secret. You can put it in without the magazine release button itself being in the gun. So there is just enough wiggle room that you can rotate that magazine release all the way around. So that means when you put it in, you don't have to have it under nearly as much tension. So I'm not sure how that'll edit through, but basically at the end of the day, I just held it in place. You can see the angle it sits at, and it doesn't really take any pressure at all to get it started with a punch and lined up, and then you work the pin through, get it all back in. But you've got so much more wiggle room when you do it without this in the way. With this in there, it's impossible, or at least it was impossible for me. I went through slave pins and everything else, but once it's in there, then the button you just lift way up on the mag release and the button can go right in. So that totally sucked. As you guys know, I'm not big fans of editing. The slave pin was useless, but in this case, since that was like a half hour of excruciating frustration, I'm gonna edit that out for you. All right, so last week, all right, the next bit we want to do is position the disconnector and the extractor. The reason you do the extractor at the same time is because the extractor must go in first. The disconnector, once it slides in here, it's going to hold the extractor in place. And so the tricky bit here is actually getting it to align with the rails of the trigger bar. So you gotta make it won't hold itself in there. So again, we're using the ejector first, so it holds on to its little tiny pin. We slide the disconnect device into place. We hold it, and we temporarily are going to shove the sear pin through to hold it in place. And actually, temporarily, I'm going to put the hammer pin through because the sear is what we're going to be working on. All right, so now the trigger is attached to the disconnector. So the trigger goes back and forth, but if something lifts the disconnector up, trigger still goes back and forth, only now it's high enough to engage other parts. Otherwise it's down here where it can't do diddly squat. Up, does stuff, down, no stuff. So we're just going to leave the hammer pin in there temporarily. I think we can do that. And we're going to go and position these. Now, since the serrations on the sear pin are on the right, the pin has to go in from right to left, which means putting our pieces together, we also have to put our pieces on the sear pin pretty much the same way. And the trick is that they're gonna, their springy bit is gonna fight us a little bit. So needle nose pliers are a good friend for this. Be real careful not to crimp the whoops. There's two things you got to do right. One is that little leg has to be on the front of everything. Or I guess since we're facing the back of the gun, that's the back. And I'm just going to try and grab it. And I'm going to pull out the sear pin to make room for it. And I'm just going to get it tucked in there and launch the sear spring across the room. Mother of pearl. Where did you go? Oh, there you are, hiding under a Beretta. I feel like there's got to be an easier way to hold this whole thing together. I think I'm going to try and just put the hammer pin in from that side, because the springs, you can't see this because I'm working underneath it. Let's try and do the whole thing upside down. Not so much help. All right, so I'm going to try and do it holding it up like this. And the tricky bits are that this spring, can try and put the spring on, quote unquote, first. But the spring is going to be under a little bit of tension. But maybe it'll sit in there. And then the sear itself. again, right now I'm just trying to get it onto the pin. And at the same time, I'm going to make sure that it's kind of far enough back that once I slide it onto the pin, I'll be on the right side of the leg of the gold pin. So just getting the sear in there is good, but just remember proper positioning. It has to be all the way on the right, where it will then lift up that spring a little bit, and as well as all the way on the right. There we go. The bottom leg has to have hooked right down there where we just hooked it. So now the sear is right where it's supposed to be and tucked over to the right. I'm going to set that down for a second, and we're going to try and position this guy. This guy is probably going to be a little harder because no matter what we do here, it's going to be a bit of a fight. Trying to find somewhere to grab him so that the spring stays in place at the same time as I'm not obstructing the path for where the sear goes. And doing all of that with the knowledge that the minute I go to put this in there, it's going to come under spring tension. So, again, lift up here. Now, I guess we don't need this guy to hold things in place anymore. Oh, balls. You know, if I put it in this far upside down, it's possible I say, I can get it in there. Just backing the pin out of the way so that I can get him lined up. And that's really all I care about right now, is lined up. Because once we're lined up, then everything will be held in place so that when they flip around, the springs are on the correct position. So the springs are now touching the top of the gun, and if we get the trigger bar out of the way, we can see the one thing that I just completely screwed up. As we pointed out before, the hammer block doesn't quite ever clear the trigger. So even if I pull the trigger all the way and down, I don't think I can rotate my hammer block through, which means I've got to pull this back out and put it in with more spring tension at the front of the process. Because at the end of the day, he has to be on the right side of the trigger bar. So a little lucky manipulation. Let's line him up with the frame a little bit better. Now you can see that the trigger bar will always operate the hammer stop, but once this guy gets rotated into place, he can snap over the trigger bar, so he's not so big a deal. We can position him essentially manually if we have to. Alright, so now we just want to line the sear pin up with the sear hole as best we can, so that when we tap it in, hopefully I haven't left any parts out. this here. So if something is holding our disconnector up, it operates both of them like it's supposed to. And of course, now I've dorked everything up. But again, if you have to, this guy, normally the hammer is going to be there to keep him from getting too far out of the way. So for the next stage of assembly, which is the hammer, I highly recommend that you push the trigger bar up behind those guys, because they'll help hold it out of the way. And here is one of the hardest things for me to try and describe, because there's just, alright, so if we look down in there, this piece here, boy, I can't point at the same time, this piece here that I'm touching, that is the disconnector. And the spring that's going to lift it up needs to go just barely under it. It's this goofy spring here, and it lays along the side of the hammer like this. So when we put the hammer in, we also have to be inserting this leg of the spring under the front connector bar that holds the left and right sides of everything together. And this is just a bear to aim. So basically, every little hole in there it's going to want to get into. And me having big old fat fingers doesn't help, because there's just no way to show this. It's just too deep, too dark. But what we're going to do is come around to the front and look for where did that disconnector spring end up. Right now it's not in the right position. A couple different things happened there. One is my trigger bar slipped back down, so there's less room for it. And now I just can't see the little fucker. Alright, so the other thing that I've managed to do once is get this spring in position first. And so there's just more real estate to get it under everything it's supposed to be under, over everything it's supposed to be over, and close to being in the right position. And by close, I mean that it'll be under the disconnector and to the right of the sear. And if we're lucky, we can get it in there just so, and then drop it. So try again, and I know there's no seeing this. Now pondering whether having the hammer pin in there just a little bit will let me let it get caught or not. Thinking it might. And the question is can I get the hammer in there in such a way as it will engage it without knocking it all over the place? And I think the answer to that is no. Alright, so once again, I'm going to try and go in there and guide everything through at once. So I'm going to manipulate the hammer from the top, and the spring from the sides, come around to the front to see where is the spring. See it. Oh, it's stuck in the hammer hole itself. Balderdash.
I just realized when I plugged in my Dremel tool, I plugged out one of my other lights. That more light is more gooder. I'm thinking that if I could just tuck that guy under, maybe the fact that right now it's at the top wouldn't be the end of the world. Oh, and I'm right. Holy shit snacks. Alright, so I'm going to try and shine enough light on here so you guys can see what all happened. Let's see. Is that, can you guys see that? See the spring where it's moving? Underneath the disconnector bar. So if I push this disconnector bar down, that spring lifts it back up. Push it down, spring lifts it up. That's the correct placement of the spring through the hammer. And so that's the disconnect and the bang all in action. So again, we see it with the spring holding the trigger bar up, the hammer block gets moved back, and then the sear on the right gets moved back. Now technically that's the point where the hammer can go forward, but I don't have enough fingers to demonstrate it all at the same time. Let me try that again. So hammer block, sear, and if I had the right hammer angle, it would go forward. Yeah. Well, it's not overly important. There we go. That's the hammer forward. Okay, so that was a pain in the ass. All right. Rest of it hopefully not going to be too horrible. This piece I generally put in upside down. Again, remember that we have a compressed spring under there. And so all we really have to do is get the hammer strut out of our way. And I'll just do the whole thing upside down. So, whoops. Put this in basically through the side here and get there's my one pin. My one pin started. You know what? I'm going to be double smart and do that from the far side. So by doing it from the far side, it means I can get it far enough in there that it's going to hold on to stuff, and then I can come in with another punch to push down that spring until it gets over it, and then straighten the part out so the pin lines up, and then straighten out the whole thing so it lines up with the actual sides there. So now this guy is free to dangle around, and again he's only gonna, whoops. Oh, son of a... Alright.
obviously I'm getting tired and I'm making mistakes. I had that backwards. It doesn't go like that. It goes like this. Don't know what I was thinking. So we're just going to do that one more time. Start the pin from the side. Get it in there. Come in with a punch. Hold it down. Line it up. Alright. So that's the whole hard part. Getting the other pin lined up is pretty easy. Just basically pull the trigger while you're moving it around, and that will move the parts back and forth. And then you just gotta align him with the other side as well. And now we go back to our clever plan of holding stuff in with at least one side there. And we also want to make sure that this guy is free to move, so that if we pull him down, he pops back up. And he does. So I'm going to put one screw in over here. It's just so I only have to worry about those pins on one side. I'm going to go ahead and drift my hammer pin back in. Okay, so coming up to the final punch. So we're going to get these pieces all ready to go. So we're going to reassemble the bottom half of the spring mechanism. Make sure that the spring actually in the cup. We're just going to have this piece on standby. And then we're going to kind of line everything up at once. And now the things that you have to line up are that the tail of the hammer strut has to get into that cup, right? And the little tiny spring just has to be right there on the inside of that. And from there, you just guide the whole thing in, front and back. And then we can take off this side plate again. And we can start this pin. What I want to do is I want to get him started through the grip safety just a little bit. There we go. And then I'm going to use punch to push that in and get him started to the next step. Push him in again and push him in. So that's compressing that part. And so now our grip safety should work. So it's the force of that safety itself pushing back up that pushes the grip safety out. The grip safety is putting pressure on that little spring that's lifting this up, and this is the disconnect, and it's connected to the trigger bar, so it moves trigger bar up and down. Hopefully you can see that moving. And then of course, if you try and pull the trigger, you're blocked because the trigger is pushing both the sear and the hammer block, but it's pushing them into the safety, which is pushing into the grip itself. And so it can't go nowhere. So the grip safety, it's held in by the pin at the bottom because it does rotate around that. There's a little flat piece up at the top that keeps it from falling out of the top. So we tucked that under as we did it. But basically now, if we do our grip, I'm going to put my finger here because this is a notoriously bad gun for dry firing. You don't want to just let that slam. If you noticed, it does not reach the frame, which means it's bottoming out by basically running into the front of the middle of the sear. So it's really bad for the sear pin and everything else to let that slam. So again, the disconnect. Let's cock the whole thing. All right. So we fire, bang. The disconnect happens, and it goes back. And when we release, we let up. The hammer block drops back into place. That's the black one on the left. And at the same time as the trigger goes forward, then that spring is allowed to lift it back up as well. So we pull, whoops, there I just did what I said not to do. Pull the trigger, and it auto disconnects, by the way. The end of the trigger stroke is the disconnect. It doesn't actually have to get disconnected by the frame. It just also gets disconnected by the frame as a safety mechanism. But generally, the over travel that's present in your trigger pull is sufficient to disconnect it. So even though I didn't touch the disconnector, it fell down when the hammer came up. So if you watch over here on the disconnector, as soon as the hammer comes up, it goes down, so it's ready to catch the hammer, and it doesn't even let the trigger come back into engagement until you're at the reset point. And the grip safety works. Almost lost a pin. Grip safety works, nothing, and whoops, bang. All right, so now that we are reassembled, check for extra parts. Winner, chicken dinner, no extra parts. I got to get my good Torx screwdrivers. Again, you don't have to screw these on super tight because you're just trying to compress the O-ring enough that once the O-ring has got pressure and you turned it a little bit, it'll stop moving and squish, and it's not going to back out on its own. So last but not least is reassembly. So in case you've forgotten all what happened, we want the barrel to be relatively well aligned with the center, which is going to push this block back so that it's actually up. Now, if you notice, if we just tried to slide this on, it would hit here and have a problem. But that's actually designed to deal with it that way, because when something pushes really hard on this, it also will go up. So don't fret about that being blocked on the rails. What's most important is that you get the barrel as best centered as you can. So the barrel's all the way back, pushing this block all the way back, and you want to make sure it's centered. And when you go to slide it on, the first thing you'll feel, whoops, is bumping into that block. If you just push past it, it should work. So it took a little pressure, but we got past it. And we got right on, which means our barrel was correctly lined up. So we are now back all the way on. Now, what happens to me, I'll show you the common
failure that I experienced with this. Is having the barrel off to one side or the other. Alright, so now our barrel not quite right. So we go to put this on. Well, and nothing's going to work. This barrel can't be that far off, obviously, but let's see if we can just get it just cattywampus enough to cause the problem I'm trying to illustrate. So here we push past it and it does snap, but then the barrel, oh shit, it lined up again. If your barrel doesn't line up, you'll get it to a point where the barrel stops here or another ½ inch out and the slide goes back, but the barrel is way out here. If that happens, just grab the barrel and rotate it a little bit left and right until it pulls into where it's supposed to align. Because that's all it means, is that you saw that the barrel seats in the frame. A couple times that I put it together, I missed that seating arrangement, and so the barrel would get stuck, and I would be like, now what do I do? It's just grab the barrel, rotate a little bit left or right until it lines up, and then the whole thing will go back on to this position where you can't go any further forward. You can go back, but you can't go any further forward than this because of the standard takedown practice. Now, the last little doodad here is the way the slide lock works. This spring leg here, this little tiny guy here, this piece is going to slip under him. So the spring will ride on top of that. So when anything lifts this up, the spring will want to bring it back down. So don't, shove this in here at maximum angle, or you'll go over it and nothing will work. So again, bring it back till the half moon notch is lined up. Push the pin in, guide it in, and remember, before you engage that little tiny spring, see it from the top, sort of, make sure the slide lock itself is at the bottom so it goes under it. And then it'll snap into place. And you'll be able to lock it back, drop it forward, fire, reset, fire again. Pew, pew, pew. It's a gun. I think that's it. I will spare you, with the magic of editing, the half-hour journey into trying to figure out how to get the stupid magazine release back in before I figured out the trick. So you didn't have to watch that, but I assure you there was much pain and suffering involved. That's it. Stay safe. A monk and a clone and a Ferengi are going bowling.